Hey guys, welcome back to Storytime 2. They called it a game. Today we're going to be reading episodes 11 and 12. If you're not caught up, go get caught up. As always, there will be links to every previous episode in the description. If you like what you hear, hit that pretty little red subscribe button and that depressing little gray bell, because otherwise YouTube will not tell you when new episodes come out. Make sure to tell everybody that you know to do the same, and that way I can improve my production values. Win-win. Anyways, let's get to the story. Today is episodes 11 and 12 of They Called It a Game. Spoiler alert. The snow and ice were quickly melting into raindrops and slurry of mud and blood on the ground. I could see Dave's feet sinking in and his stance beginning to falter. I had no idea how long he had been at this. In my stupor, I tried again to stand, but my legs would not move from underneath me. I couldn't feel my hands or my feet. The cold had definitely taken its toll on us all. We would have been well advised to prepare for this, but we had no idea that we would be stranded in the ice and snow for so many hours. Lori was standing next to me, clearly protective. She stood like a savior, launching arrows into not only Forge, but the various spawn that he was casting off from his massive lumbering form. The dog-sized homunculi appeared to be made of a mixture of stone and molten steel. "Can you stand yet?" Lori cried to me as she drew back another arrow and loosed it straight into the body of a Forge spawn that clearly set its gaze on me, the wounded member of the pack. I'm trying, but my arms won't move. I can't even feel my feet or hands," I shouted back to her. The battlefield was an uproar with spells and the clashing of swords and shields. Forge took up almost the entirety of the town center that we had corralled him into. A few weeks ago, this fight might have fit here, but now it was clearly pressing us outside of our preparations. "How many are down?" I asked Lori, just hoping to find that we had been doing well. I knew that odds were grim, but all I had at this point was hope. No way to know. Her tone was sad and forlorn. I could hear that the hope inside of her was slowly fading. This fight was taking everything out of us, and there was nothing I could do to help. "You're a fucking burden, right? I don't want to be harsh on you, Z, but this is no time for your usual crybaby bullshit. We're dying here, and you need to stand the fuck up. Dave isn't going to last forever." Lori had a certain way with being direct that very few people I knew could pull off. She was cold and heartless, but most of all, brutally honest and deeply compassionate. I mean, behind the cold heartlessness, of course. "Now what do you need? You need me to call Hart over and get you dealt with, or can you manage with a pot?" She waved over at another of our archers as she spoke, and once they turned to face us, she reached into her belt pouch and produced a single flask of a red liquid we had started to call potion. It was a mixture of several herbal remedies from the old world, but it had been granted new properties that directly healed the body, restoring strength to the fight. "Yeah, let me give it a shot. But don't worry about Hart. Call your hubby over. We've been working on something." I grabbed the small flask from her hands and quickly popped out the cork, downing the mixture and taking a deep breath. I braced my hands on the muddy ground and began to lift myself up. Rather quickly the potion did its work, and I was able to muster the strength to stand, though not as firmly as I would have liked. I wiped some filth from my eyes and, able to see clearly, I could tell that Adam was working his way around the great beast to my location, when he was surprised by 3 Forge spawn. Lori tried to cover him, but was the only archer with any kind of a shot on him, and I'll never forget the sound of her cries as the beast dragged Adam into the city streets and out of our sight. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she screamed out, unleashing a flurry of arrows onto Forge. And when her quiver had emptied, she drew her pair of carefully weighted daggers. The tears that streamed down her face began to glow as they emerged. She began to charge as her body became consumed with a bright green light. The tears and the drops of rain began to rise around her, defying gravity as she pressed in ever closer to the great behemoth. She was moving faster now than I had ever seen a person move. It was almost a blur as she leapt high into the air and looked the mammoth monstrosity directly in the eye before beginning her emotional assault. Her first attack lands, a decisive blow as Forge actually begins to shudder for the first time since he had emerged. I could feel the shock from that first strike even from my place on the ground. She was moving like a bolt of rage from the skies. As each devastating blow crashed upon the mighty beast, it was clear that Forge was no match for this emblazoned Valkyrie that we had called Lori. 1 strike and he shudders, 2 and he falters, 3 strikes and the Goliath falls to his knees. The rest of us could see now this was our one chance to strike. Well, don't let her fight him alone! Everyone get your asses in there, we have 1 shot! I cried out to the vanguard as I shook the mud from my Madus and began to charge in. The heat at the base of our foe was so intense that the water had covered us began to steam off as we grew closer. It was hard to gain traction in the mud. I recall my feet struggling to find a grip. Lori was still screaming at the top of her lungs, a series of flames bursting from her clothes and her blades as she leveled each furious blow upon the head of Forge, sparks and bits of molten metal erupting around each strike. She was like a woman possessed. Like a vengeful god, she indulged her hatred for this Leviathan, and we were each driven by the passion in this hatred. We could almost feel her temper, ourselves, as each of us began to rain blows upon the hardened crust of Forge. "Watch the spawn! They're still emerging, and we won't do shit surrounded!" Hart shouted above the crowd as 3 of the Forge spawn began to close in on his position. Lori was beyond any semblance of reason at this point. She clearly hadn't heard a thing Hart had said. However, the rest of us had little choice as the spawn were beginning to close in upon us as well. I looked around the field for a moment, darting back to avoid any attacks catching me off guard, and I realized I was our last remaining tank. Dave was certainly still alive, but it was all Hart could do to keep him that way, as he'd tried desperately to occupy the spawn around him as well as 3 of his own. "Hold him for 30 more seconds, Dave. I'll get you help." I shouted over to Dave and Hart, who each returned a nod to confirm they had heard me. Dave threw in a "make it fucking quick" to be sure I understood the situation. So I made my way around the field a bit, trying to find 1 or 2 people who weren't desperately surrounded, but all of us were backed into our own respective corners. However, as I was about to give up my search and dash to their aid myself, the winds around us began to chill and started to whip about violently as they formed a swirling set of clouds in the sky. A single bolt of lightning struck down upon Forge, only barely missing Lori. What followed was like a blue light from the heavens, as ice began to rain down, crashing upon the Forge spawn and dousing their flames. Each strike was precise and seemed calculated, and with each hit another Forge spawn fell, and another bolt of lightning struck Forge directly. When I finally had the chance, I looked around the field again and saw a shadowy figure standing upon a rooftop, with a small band of spellcasters calling down ice and lightning to aid us. And a sigh of relief traveled through me. Our casters had been mostly stricken down, and none of them had this kind of power. So whoever this was, they had almost certainly saved the lives of every remaining member of Titan. Before much longer, Forge had crumbled and we found ourselves scattered across a bloody and burned battlefield, where once stood an idyllic town. Our clothes had been destroyed, Lori in particular. Even her heat-protective gear had burned away in her melee with the Leviathan we called Forge. She was passed out now, exhausted from her outburst. Davrin had also succumbed to exhaustion almost the moment the Forge fell. His armor had been halfway melted, and bits of it were fused with his skin, but he was sleeping now, as our healers attended to his wounds. The losses were grim. So many that to this day we still don't know the exact numbers. But at least 1,200 had fallen that day, and only about 150 managed to regroup at camp over the next few weeks. Forge had both devastated us as well as empowered us. We had been left with more questions than answers, making it a bittersweet victory. But it was still only the beginning for our troop. That is They Called It a Game, episodes 11 and 12. Thank you as always for tuning in, and remember to tune in next time as the story continues to heat up. If you liked what you heard, remember to subscribe with that pretty little red button, and then use that depressing little gray bell to make sure YouTube will actually notify you, because otherwise they won't. Grr. As always, I hope whatever time of day it is a wonderful time for you, and until next time, take care, guys.